After careful reflection, I have concluded that the very high threshold required for the invocation of the Act was met. In particular, for reasons that I discuss in detail in the report, I've concluded that when the decision was made to invoke the Act on February 14, 2022, Cabinet had reasonable grounds to believe that there existed a national emergency arising from threats to the security of Canada that necessitated the taking of special temporary measures.
Joining us now to talk about this and his prophetic column in the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is Bruce Pardy, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who is also the Executive Director of Rights Probe and a Professor of Law at Queen's University. Bruce, I guess if you're pessimistic and imagine the worst will come, you're never disappointed, your feelings are never hurt because you already accounted for the worst outcome. I myself, despite everything, am a foolish optimist, and I had thought that this judge would say, no, there just was not enough of a factual basis for a national emergency that could only be resolved through the Emergencies Act. Because if I'm not mistaken, that's the twofold test required to invoke the Emergencies Act. Is it a grave national crisis on par with a revolution or a war? And can it only be resolved by invoking the Emergencies Act as opposed to existing laws? And I thought this judge seems fair enough. The process seems fair enough. There's no way they will meet that high hurdle. And yet, here we are.
Right. If you were going just by what you heard at the inquiry, the evidence that the witnesses gave, that would be an entirely legitimate conclusion. But this is not a court. It was never a court. It's supposed to look like one, but it's not. And its job is not the job of a court. Its job is ritual, if you like. The job is to go through a process that makes it look as though there is accountability. But that accountability is not delivered by the result. It's delivered by the process. So its purpose is served by going through all the trouble of hearing witnesses and having hearings and so on, because it gives the appearance of accountability. But we've had lots of inquiries and commissions in this country's history, and some of them lead to something, but many of them do not. And that's because they're not that kind of a process. This commission, like others, has the job of simply putting together a report. It's not a binding report. It can't find liability. The report may or may not be put on the shelf and ignored, but it is a mistake, and was a mistake from the beginning, to think that this was going to be a court-like process. There are applications outstanding challenging the invocation of the Act, and those applications hopefully will be heard in an actual courtroom. And those courts will undergo judicial review of the decision to invoke the Act, and hopefully they will do so in a rigorous way, comparing the facts to the threshold in the Act, and we'll find out legally whether or not the threshold was met. But that was first and foremost not the mandate of the commission, both in black and white, but also in reality.
Well, I was fooled. And maybe it was my hope, maybe it was my romantic belief that part of our system isn't broken, that not every, in fact, there were some police chiefs who testified, not all of them, but most of them were, and you even had the attorneys general of other provinces testifying before this commission saying, look, we did not need this martial law. We did not ask for it. Many of the blockades were resolved before it was invoked, for example, at the Coots border crossing or at the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit. And again, time after time, cop after cop said, we didn't need it. Sure, it gave us extra tools, but we were fine handling this on our own with some tow trucks. And, they cleared the Ambassador Bridge without incident in 2 days. I'm just astonished, and I'm a little heartbroken. And here's what I think Here's what I'm most worried about, Bruce, is that people like me who are laboring to still believe in the system will become disenchanted. I still believe in the system because I don't know what I would do if I didn't believe in the system. I don't know how I would handle that. I still believe in nonviolent solutions to problems. I still believe that our system may get it wrong at first, but eventually gets it right. I believe that the checks and balances, the pendulum will swing back. I believe those things, but it gets harder to believe those things. This felt like an inside job, felt like a stitch up.
Well, yes. I mean, I know it feels that way, and you may have an argument there, but what I'm suggesting is that that's not really what it was designed for in the first place. So I'm, for example, I'm not accusing this judge of doing something he didn't believe was true. Now, you could disagree with it, and I do. I completely disagree with the conclusion. But that's not because necessarily the judge was biased in the way that we might say that. What I'm saying is this process, as imagined in the act itself and as put in place by the government, was not one that would logically lead to the kind of outcome that a lot of people were hoping for. And as you say, if you had taken the trouble to watch the testimony over those weeks, there were some really interesting moments and some very good testimony, including by some of the police officers and officials that appeared. I was quite impressed with some of them, and they made the point that you referred to. And in particular, some of them were very specific about the fact that they, in their opinion, there was not the kind of violence that the government alleged that there was that justified the invocation of the act. There was one OPP officer in particular who said that in the context of the Ottawa convoy, he said that he found the lack of violence shocking. In that kind of situation, he would have expected violence, but there wasn't any. And so in that respect, and in the testimony of so many others, the justification based upon the use or threats of serious violence, which is one of the causes that the government itself cites in its invocation of the act, for my money, the evidence was simply not there. There were lots of references to violence. And one of the best, I think, was the acting Ottawa Police Chief, Steve Bell, who testified of violence experienced by the local community during the convoy. But Brendan Miller, who was acting for the convoy, cross-examined him and asked him, well, what he meant. What do you mean? What do you mean by the violence felt by the local community? And the interim police chief said, well, I don't mean actual violence. I don't mean violence as defined in the criminal code. I mean the violence that people felt from the culmination of actions that the occupiers engaged in, like honking horns.
Here, let's take a listen to that outrageous clip. Take a look.
So is it fair to say that when you use the phrase violence, you're not actually describing any form of physical assaults, are you? Well, physical assaults do contribute to what I'm describing. I was specifically describing the violence that our community felt as a result of the culmination of actions that the occupiers engaged in. So the violence that they felt, not actual violence, is that what you're saying? That is correct. Not the criminal code definition of violence, but the violence that they felt by having incessant horns blared. Right. And by having trucks run 24/7 a day. Right. By having people intimidate them and follow them, and by having people rip masks off their head, by feeling sheltered in their homes. Well, thank you. I understand what you mean. But you're not talking about violence under Section 2 of the Emergencies Act, are you? No, I'm not. Thanks.
That's not a real cop. That's a political activist wearing a badge. That was an excerpt from the Ezra Levant Show. I'm Ezra Levant. Every weekday, I do a monologue about the topic of the day. Then I interview a fascinating guest, either in studio or via Skype. And then I read your mail, whether it's fan mail or hate mail, which is sometimes even more interesting. This is on our premium service, though, called Rebel News Plus. Go to rebelnewsplus.com. It's $8 a month or less if you buy a whole year in advance. You get my show every weeknight, plus Sheila Gunn Reid's show every week. It's called The Gun Show. It's pretty amazing. You know, we rely on you because we do not take a dime from the government. In Canada, that makes us almost unique. So please help us out and help yourself to some great journalism at rebelnewsplus.com.